My name is Fernando, Maymi, as Natalie pointed out. And if you're like me, you probably have no shortage of people in all kinds of media telling you gloom and doom stories, and how when it comes to cyberspace, we really don't know jack about defending our systems. Well, after spending 2 days in the trenches with technical and business leaders from across New York City, I think we're in a good position to tell you that when it comes to defending the Big Apple in cyberspace, I think we do know jack. The gentleman in the slide here is our very own Captain John Hermling. So any similarity that he may have to a pop culture trivia game from the early 90s or any other time period is entirely coincidental. I did not mean that to be there. I'm just highlighting the word jack because, as it turns out, it has something to do with what we're here to tell you about. Judy?
So within the Army Cyber Institute, we have a research that focuses on cyber-related exercises across academia, industry, and government. And last week, as Fernando stated, we conducted a 3-day event called Jack Voltaic, which was really an experiment in the form of an exercise that we did in partnership with Citigroup that really, from the time of development to execution, took 4 months to execute. But the idea really spawned from a concept known as mutual assistance. And what I mean by mutual assistance is really referring to the common framework that exists within the energy sector that occurs during an incident where there's, in the physical domain, where there's a natural disaster resulting in a power outage, and normally during a mutual assistance, assets and capabilities from regions from across the nation gather together to provide response and recovery. And that system works pretty well, and it continues to refine as events occur. Now then, considering the cyberspace domain, we have cyber mutual assistance, but that particular aspect within the cyberspace domain is a challenge. It's one that the energy sector and public and private are currently working on to try to see how we can get, because cyber mutual assistance is something that has many challenges. For one example is assets. So whenever you're talking about cyber analysts or operators, they're not as abundant. So we need to figure out how to do that. And so one example that I can share with you is the attack on the Ukrainian power grid. So we learned very quickly that we couldn't just invest resources to the protection and defense of systems. We also had to consider, like in the physical domain, a response and recovery plan. So the Army Cyber Institute really wanted to research this mutual assistance further by exploring it through an exercise called Jack Voltaic. But we needed a scope, and so we wanted to focus the scope to be very small-scaled and focus within a cyber attack in New York City, considering the New York emergency responders. Jack Voltaic, public-private, multi-sector exercise. Public being government, private being non-government, multi-sector. What I'm really referring to there are the 16 critical infrastructures as defined by the Department of Homeland Security: energy, finance, transportation, just to name a few examples. Within Jack Voltaic, we incorporated 6 sectors in this scenario. But before I talk about before I go into the specifics about the emergency responders, I'd like to also point out some unique facts about this exercise. So, multi-sector exercises is not something that is not common within the cyber exercise realm. We see these at the national strategic level, regional, multi-state, but when considering a local municipality, not very common, so we really wanted to focus there. The other thing is, when considering a cyber exercise, there's normally 2 components seen. You normally see a tabletop exercise or a live fire exercise. Both components literally are simulation environments, tabletop really catering to the management, senior executive level types in a facilitated discussion led by a moderator. Then you have your LFX component, which is really targeted at those technical hands-on keyboard analysts and operators, where you have blue teams, defenders, against red teams, which is your opposing force, mounting the attack on blue networks. But in this exercise, we wanted to incorporate both.
No, first things first, we had to build the right team. We had Citigroup already as a collaborator, and the reason we linked up with them is because they have a very robust exercise capability, obviously within their sector, so they have a very good, nice vertical thing going for them. But we needed breadth, and that's why we brought the rest of the team members into the equation. One of the cool things about bringing them in was, as we reached out to all these organizations, there was a lot of interest. People got it. People understood why it was important, but they were kind of hesitant because they looked at the scope and said, that's a big thing. That's a huge commitment for us, and what if it doesn't pan out? Now, as time went by, the commitment from these organizations grew to the point where the ideas were flowing in. One of the critically important things about Jack Voltaic is that we built the team first. Then we decided what the scenario was. A lot of times exercises are built the other way around, and we have a fixed scenario, we have an issue that we're going to explore, and then we figure out, well, given this, who should be at the table? Well, we did it backwards, and the reason for that was we wanted each sector to contribute to the conversation in terms of what the scenario should be. This is a very collaborative decision-making environment, and not every idea made it to the final version of the exercise. And part of the reason for that is because the attack surface for New York City is immense. Right? If you think about all the complex systems and their even more complex interdependencies, that's kind of the environment in which we were operating. So as the ideas came in, we had to do a lot of horse trading, because one organization may want to exercise this particular capability. Well, that conflicts with another one if you're trying to weave it all into one cohesive scenario, and then to leverage specific events that allow multiple sectors to have to share information, to have to work together. And that was a critical element to the exercise. Now, before we get much further, it's important to understand that not every good idea made it to the table. So if you don't see Godzilla walking around New York City, all right, don't blame me, because I voted for that one, I just got shut down.
So the bad day in New York City really was a strategic, methodical attack by a notional adversary that occurred over a notional 6-day period that began with impacting the financial sector with a spear-phishing attack, focusing and targeting on a financial executive. Then the adversary looked at the energy sector and began targeting a power company by embedding an insider threat, who then proceeded with installing malicious software into IT systems, which gave them control of power stations. And not only that, but it also they used the energy sector as a pivot point into other sectors, which then further enabled exploitation and compromise in the transportations, traffic tunnel and signaling systems, and then the environmental water treatment plants, where we began to see destructive malware arise. And so at this point, New York City is wondering, wow, what's going on here? It's chaos. So to make matters worse, we now begin to see the integration of kinetic attacks. Explosions in the cities are occurring, active shooters on the scenes, mass casualties in the ground, now impacting the health sector. And at this point, you have drones, people with their cell phones filming footage, all going to social media and just imagining the implications of that. And at this point, we have fire department and police department heavily engaged in trying to address the situation. But to make matters worse, the adversary then takes the database that these emergency responders use and leverage to do their mission, and they encrypt it, and it has ransomware. So in result, the adversary is successful, and they accomplished their intent to delay and slow down the emergency responders. And so what's unique about this scenario is not only is it gave a good exercise, but it was developed by those same emergency responders and sectors that participated. It was their scenario, they developed it. And the other thing, about a month into planning, we started this in May. In June, there was an article published by an author in the New York Magazine. His name is Rod Reisman, and the name of the article is called The Big Hack. And I encourage you all to read it if you have not. And the interesting thing about that article is it's essentially the same thing that we were playing out in Jack Voltaic. It's a fictional story that paints a really grim picture on attacks that have cascading effects on New York City, impacting those emergency responders who have that responsibility within the 24, 72-hour range. And so while a grim story, yes, but it sends a strong message that when considering these types of threats, obviously New York City is a big target, but we shouldn't just consider, looking at New York City. This should be something that all major large cities, and not just limit to large cities, but we should be thinking about that. And so Jack Voltaic was something that examined that.
Yeah, so it's important to consider that we don't build this only for New York City. The idea is to bring a framework that can be used in any city. Now, you can't bring pain upon the blue team, the defenders, in a live fire exercise without a really good red team. So the aggressors consisted of cadets from West Point's competitive cyber team together with their faculty advisors. And we also had professional red teamers from the New York National Guard, as well as from Con Edison and from SimSpace, which was a company that provided the virtual range infrastructure that we used for the exercise. Their approach to breaking into things and wreaking havoc was dictated by the scenario elements that the planning team put together. So this is, again, driven by the sectors. So two specific items that they asked for were phishing and ransomware. So and to put things in context, keep in mind that what the aggressors are doing here is they are trying to establish a cyber foothold that will allow them to amplify or magnify the effects of a kinetic attack. So this is all tied to the physical events or the kinetic events that are going to happen later in the play. In order to do that, they're going to simulate criminal behavior. And that's where the ransomware comes in. Now, this may look a little bit far-fetched in your minds right about now, but remember I mentioned horse trading earlier? So we have to figure out a way to weave all these elements together that all the sectors wanted to exercise. So phishing attack. The infrastructure that we got from SimSpace had agents on each of the workstations which behaved similarly to real users. So they would send email and surf the web and create files and, yes, click on links that they shouldn't be clicking on in phishing attempts, right? I know that's far-fetched, but I'm told that some users actually do that in the wild. Past the phishing, once they were inside, they were going to infect the workstations and some servers with ransomware. Now, the idea really was not financially motivated. It was not to make money, but rather to deny access to critical assets such as the Critical Response Information Management System, the CRIMS database that we talked about earlier. So if you go in and destroy that outright, then you're going to tip your hand that there's going to be a kinetic attack coming. So what they did was they disguised the event as ransomware. One of the lessons learned here was, as good as all the individual operators were, they had never worked together. I mean, the cadet team had worked together, but in a different context. They had never done something like this. So bringing them together for the exercise, even though they had access to the range beforehand, they had to basically get to know each other a little better on the spot and learn each other's capabilities before they could act cohesively as a team, which caused a slow start to the nefarious activities. Similarly, the blue team had the same challenge on the way in. Now here, the landscape is a little bit different because we had 3 different networks that we were operating. They're all connected, but they were focused on 3 different networks. One was the financial sector, one was the utility sector, and one was the government sector. And here, the teams exhibited a broad range of different backgrounds. The financial sector plucked out one of their teams from one of their SOCs, their Security Operations Center, to include the SOC director, and they plopped them down here. So these people already knew how to work with each other, and they had a lot of experience, and they knew each other's weaknesses and strengths. Awesome. On the far other end of the scale, we had the government sector. Now, these folks were equally competent and good, but the difference here was that they had never worked together in this kind of exercise. Now, it's not remarkable because this is the first time we try it, just like it's the first time I'm trying one of these darn things. So that part is not surprising, but it took them a while to get to know each other. And there was a lot of, again, jockeying for position and figuring out who fit in which role. Now, I promised you in the abstract to the talk that I was going to give you a play-by-play and freeze frame and all that happy stuff. So let me give you a quick example of some of the action that actually happened on the network. What I'm showing on the board is the financial sector network that was actually used for the live fire range. It is representative of any major bank. Now, obviously, we didn't want to use the real thing because we didn't want a bank to actually put their real infrastructure in a report that's going to be made public. That's not smart. But what they were able to do was configure it to fit their particular training requirements and also ask for any specific tools that they wanted to see in the scenario play. Here's the play. So the attackers come in through a phishing attempt that exploits one of their executives. From that box, they laterally move until they gain access to a domain administrator's account named Greta. And Greta happens to have credentials, as you would imagine, on the domain controllers for the network. This is ground zero for a big part of this attack. The defenders notice the incursion, and they start doing their triaging and their response. They realize, oh my gosh, this is pretty big. We need to send a change request up the chain to get this box off the network so we can respond it. Naturally, you don't just yank a box off the network. You have to make sure that you understand the business impact. The request goes up through channels, right? And the white cell, the referees realized what a critical pivotal point this was in the battle, so they delayed the request. Now, this is not a far-fetched notion, because a lot of times you send these requests up, and senior managers have to debate whether or not to do particular actions that, to us security practitioners, would make perfect sense. So the request was delayed, and the team got tired. The team lead made a call, said, we're pulling the plug in the box anyway. We're taking it off the network. We threw a flag on that play. Say, wait. What do you mean you're going to do that? And he said, well, I have that authority. In the real world, if this happens and the response is delayed, it's my call. I take the box off the network because I'm not going to watch my assets be siphoned off the network. Makes perfect sense. We checked the playbook. It panned out. All right, no penalty on the play. Oops, I guess I should have been doing this all along, right? Fast forward in the exercise, and now the government sector has a similar challenge, and they make the exact same decision. Again, we throw a flag on the play. Their response, well, I made that decision because I also am a SOC manager. I'm a SOC director. Where in the playbook does it say that you are allowed to do that? Well, we don't know. Now, can they do it or not? That was a topic that was going to be then next addressed at the tabletop discussion, the tabletop exercise, because this is the technical side that feeds the conversation or drives the conversation that the leaders and the business leaders and the technical leaders have at the tabletop exercise, which is what Judy's going to address next. Oh, this thing is going to go off.
So with the TTX, just to emphasize that same scenario that Fernando was describing to you in the LFX, the same conversation, maybe not the exact same instance of the scenario, was being discussed. So what that says is there are concepts, if it's a cyber event, in this case we correlated these by cyber events, that can be leveraged during a cyber exercise collective training where it involves the components of a LFX and TTX to work together to be able to provide that organizational collective training. And so the other piece to point out with the TTX that I thought was interesting was during the drone footage, the conversation came up about, well, why don't we just shoot down the drone? But from the NYPD perspective, they looked at that as, well, that could be operational information, that could be intelligence. Really, we need to start thinking here when it comes to the local level, and so those questions are escalated and educate upward as well. So in summary, Jack Voltaic was a unique experience that the Army Cyber Institute and Citigroup were very excited to be about and be a part of. But everything that's listed here is kind of the way forward, but really the significance here is really getting folks to think about when we're training and preparing and conducting cybersecurity. Yes, we have our individual type training, but organizationally, we have to work together. It's not about just the technical folks or the manager folks, and even if it is, we need those types of exercises that help us think outside the box, that are flexible enough, agile enough, so that way we can work together and work through those processes, the information sharing processes. But one of the primary things that we hope to get out of this is establishing a framework for cities that'll be exported, and hopefully other cities can use this.
Did you have any DHS participation?
Yes, so no, excellent question. That question came up all the time. What about including your federal entities? Absolutely. So in the development of this exercise that we did not put emphasis is we consulted with all entities. So DHS was one of them, Cyber Command was another, just to name a few, because the Army Cyber Institute, while conducting research on these types of things, we wanted to make sure we consult with the people that are in the charter that do these things day in, day out. And alongside, we even had several of them at the exercise providing observations, and hopefully some of that input will result in the academic report.
Yeah, so you just hit my follow-on, and that was there a sense that they were capturing the lessons learned to start building out scenarios? Because I had a chance to talk to Dr. Osment at the start of the year, and they were at that point were still fumbling the ball rather badly. Their blame line at the end was, I think we'll hand this off to the Cyber National Mission Force. Talked to Paul Menacasoni. He did not concur with that assessment.
But one thing I will add, though, that being a researcher at the Army Cyber Institute that I picked up on very quickly, because my background is really in Cyber Command, is that when you focus on exercises and DHS, they have it really good when it comes to tabletop exercises. They have a good system. So I think it's definitely things that we can learn from them as far as techniques, tactics, and procedures and how we do training for cyber exercises. So that's a good question. Thank you.
So we didn't ignore the federal agencies. We de-emphasized them so that the Office of Emergency Management in New York City would take the lead and not just simply be a bystander. And that's exactly what their role would be in an event like this.
So working with private and public entities, did you find that over time you evolved to a chain of commands? I mean, how did it, did everyone have an equal say? How did that pan out for you?
Well, in this, there is certainly an organizational structure. I wouldn't compare it directly with military, but within every organization there is some side of structure, and yes, there was, but in the meetings that we had, they were really brainstorm sessions, coming together with planners alike, really talking through what do we want, what is a bad day in New York City, how can we exercise this? So it was really a bunch of folks coming together with their creative, innovative ideas, objectives on what they wanted to play out and make their exercise.
Now, in terms of execution, there was no chain of command, as you would imagine. There was a lot of dialogue. And what the challenge was, if you keep the tabletop exercise at a very high level, then you're not going to get into the really thorny issues that underlie that high-level discussion. And that's exactly what we were able to accomplish here by, again, de-emphasizing the federal involvement. It was all city-driven, right? So this is where there was a lot of discussion, some of them very, very animated, saying, well, what do you mean you're going to do that? You can't do that. Well, yeah, I have the authority to do it. Yeah, but just because you have that authority doesn't mean it makes sense for a synchronized response.
How did the differing regulatory frameworks get exposed or explored in the exercise? So banking industry the financial industry has a number of different regulatory regimes, the energy sector, variety of different regulatory regimes.
Okay, no, that's a good question. So again, we really wanted to approach the development of this with an open mind. Certainly, this exercise had a DHS influence to it because it was inspired from an existing DHS exercise, but it also had a very Cyber Command, so there was a lot of influences. But we intentionally kept any type of regulatory frameworks out because we wanted to really keep this open as an experiment. And then perhaps moving forward, if we were to do something similar, then we would incorporate some of those regulatory frameworks.
So each sector was responsible for applying their regulatory frameworks in support of their training requirements. So the best way to summarize it is those frameworks became limiting factors or constraints rather than drivers to action. So we didn't so much concern ourselves with what they were required to do, rather what they were not allowed to do.
Did you notice any significant differences between how the financial team recovered from how the ICS industrial systems recovered? Was there anything ICS faced that the financial defenders did not? Make sense?
I have to tell you that we were, this is the first iteration. So personally, we have a lot of improvements that we'd love to see in the future. One of them was the ICS SCADA play was very, very limited. So we focus instead on the IT systems rather than the OT systems in the utility sector. Still, there was some SCADA-like effects, but they were fairly light. But this again, part of the issue is developing trust in the community and bringing out what are those really ugly skeletons we have hiding in the closet. We really want to bring to the conversation in a controlled manner to get after those threats to SCADA and ICS.
You mentioned that the financial sector was initially reluctant to give you their architecture and that you were operating solely on a local level. But on the federal level, we've seen more things with DoD and industry with requirements for information sharing, vulnerability sharing, to be able to help, like DHS and industry and SCADA systems and what we can do with DoD collaboration with that. Did you see, it sounds like you saw a similar thing on the local level, where there's a reluctance to maybe share vulnerabilities or that somebody got hit. Did you see that kind of lack of trust?
Personally, I saw a lot of information sharing. So there was a lot of, once the players were in a room and they got to know each other, even though they're working on opposite sides of the room, there's a lot of trust being built on the fly and information being shared on the fly. What I alluded to earlier in terms of trust and limiting the information that went out, there are very good reasons why a financial institution would not give us the blueprints to their network and allow us to put it in the open domain, because this is all open domain stuff, right? So we're not talking about classified information here. So that's where I'm talking about the trust. But no, the players themselves, there was an awful lot of trust. Both on the live fire exercise, and I think you would agree on the tabletop exercise as well, even when there were disagreements, and there were some of those, some heated, but it was a very, very open forum.
The high-level executives have a good situational awareness of who their subcontractors were and where their levels of responsibility stopped and the others began, or do they just take ownership of the problem as an agency as itself?
So the participants were really that first line supervisor, manager. We didn't get into the senior executive levels, and so we had a lot of wiggle room here. So there wasn't a lot of restrictions and particulars as, okay, well, these are the boundaries that we can talk with and communicate in. We really left it open. We really wanted to play out the scenario to really provoke thought and really go through those information, prevention, response type of actions, just as an experiment. But definitely moving forward, we've definitely picked up on a lot of things on where we could focus and maybe direct, but a lot of those things go back to trust and providing exposure. The New York City emergency responders have never seen anything like this, particularly on the live fire exercise. They were just like, wow, So it's just things like that where when we think about innovative ways to exercise, that was the key thing. So hopefully I answered your question. Okay.